afternoon, Your Highnesses, Excellencies, dignitaries, members of the ABLF network, and all of our wonderful guests here with us today. My name is Resham Katecha, and I'm a policy and strategy specialist based in the UK. I am delighted to be here with you today at the ABLF. And to start off, I'm really delighted to introduce an incredibly talented man, Dr Krishnamurthy Subramanian, who is currently the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. He is a leading expert on economic policy, banking, and corporate governance, and he advocates ethical wealth creation through a marriage of the invisible hand of the market with the hand of trust. He has previously served on several expert committees, including the PJ Nayak Committee on Governance of Banks for the Reserve Bank of India, and he has so many bows to string. I do not have enough time to tell you all about his incredible achievements. So I'm going to get straight into asking him the questions that I know you all want to hear the answers to. So Subramanian, thank you so much for being with us here today. It's a great pleasure and privilege.
Thank you very much, Resham, and a very good morning to all the viewers. Hope you are safe and healthy wherever you are.
Wonderful. I hope they are too. So you obviously have an incredibly challenging job advising the government through a particularly tumultuous time. As we look forward to recovery out of COVID from a health perspective, what do you think the next steps are for the government and the private sector in order to come out of the challenging economic times and try and boost growth over the coming years?
That's a good question. I think it's useful to understand the policy measures, that the Indian government has taken over the last 1 year, and how those have impacted, the economy and the country. I think the first step to recognize is if you look at the top 30 countries, and in our this year's economic survey, we covered this. India has, done very well in managing the pandemic, has saved about 100,000 lives compared to what could have been, and has saved almost, close to 3.5 to 4 million cases, compared to what could have been. And in the economic survey, we've shown that that came about because of the courageous decision making that where in India took the tough decisions that do create that did create some short-term pain, but have then laid the seeds for a lot of long-term gains to come in. As all of you would acknowledge, economics always involves trade-offs, and I think but the trade-off where some short-term pain is taken for long-term gain is a much better trade-off than one where short-term gains are taken for long-term pain. I think that's where India, by imposing a stringent lockdown initially, and then starting from September, the unlock phase. Incidentally, just to give a sense of how well we've done, on March 24th of last year, there was a study that was released by Johns Hopkins University and Princeton University, which had laid out the scenarios for India, amidst the COVID pandemic, and their best case scenario was India having its peak by June, mid-June, when we would have had hundreds of millions of cases and millions of deaths. Of course, compared to that, we had the peak in September, and have saved several lives by just having a very clear objectives, and what we realized is that faced with a pandemic, I think the most important objective has to be to save lives from the pandemic itself, and the policy making also has been driven by research, careful research, drawing on studies both in epidemiology and in economics. So going forward, I think we will continue to do that. We have India is the only country that has done a slew of reforms, and especially focusing on aggregate supply in the economy. While most other countries have focused primarily on demand, but India has focused both on demand side and on supply side because in an emerging economy like India with a lot of supply side frictions, if we only focus on aggregate demand, what you get is typically growth for a short period with inflation, in which case fiscal and monetary policies cannot work in tandem, because when inflation happens, monetary tightening has to happen, and then monetary and fiscal policy don't work together. So India's policies have been actually quite long run driven, and we have really looked to convert this crisis into an opportunity. And here, I think especially the role of the private sector. So from a country that did not have any PPE kits at all, within just a few months, India became the leading manufacturer of PPE kits, and that's just one example of the kind of power and the ability that the private sector has. I think that is a signature change that is happening, in the Indian economic thinking, which is that earlier, of course, before liberalization up until the 1990s, it was the public sector that was given the commanding heights of the economy. Even after liberalization, words like privatization, etc., were used most, in sort of not in government communication, and private sector's role was acknowledged mostly as in an apologetic way, rather than recognizing the productivity gains and the central role that markets and private sector play. I think that is an important change that is happening in India's economic thinking, where wealth creation is not regarded as evil. It's actually regarded as as something that is good, of course, when it's done ethically. I think, and that the private sector is acknowledged for productivity that it brings. These are important changes that are happening, and if you see the thread that runs through the reforms that have happened over the last 1 year, it is about actually building a self-reliant India by empowering the private sector. I think that's a key change that is happening. And we can talk about some of the details, but I think the big picture idea that is really driving India's reform, post-COVID India is one that actually recognizes the role of the private sector, role of markets, as you had pointed out, marrying the role of markets, of the invisible hand of markets with the hand of trust, the hand of of ethical wealth creation. I think that's where India is really sort of made a signature change in its economic thinking.
So I think that's so fascinating. You've given us so much context to work with, and there's two key questions I want to pick up on. Well, three really, but I'll get to that. But the first, you talked about the focus on the AS side, your supply side policies, and you talked about supply side policies and some of the aggregate side frictions that you've had to deal with. Can you give us a little bit more information as to what you mean by that, some context and examples?
So if you look at, for instance, the reforms that have been done, and let's just look at it from some of the factors of production. Labor is a very important factor of production. Capital is another. Now, because of the labor laws that we had in the country, and do remember that India has been debating about labor laws for the last 3 decades. When in 1991, when India got the loan from the International Monetary Fund to tide over its balance of payments crisis, one of the conditionalities of that loan was to reform the labor laws. Since then, this was on the table, but actually never got done. Now that basically created a lot of frictions, what we economists call frictions in the labor markets. We had a completely unwieldy labor laws, and which did not enable job creation either, and kept firms really small. This phenomenon of dwarfs, where firms aged but never grew, and it's firms that grow that actually create jobs, not just in emerging economies, but in the United States as well. For instance, we had shown in the 2018-19 economic survey that if you look at the United States, a firm that becomes, from 5-year-old to 30-year-old, by the time it becomes 30-year-old, the firm has created almost 7 times as many jobs compared to what it created when it was 5-year-old. Wow. That same number in India is, what was about 1.4. In other words, just 40% more jobs over a 25-year, aging phenomenon of the firm. And so job creation, therefore, was far, far less because of some of these frictions on the labor market side. Similarly, if you look on the capital side, the financial sector has faced issues of quality of lending, and at the same time penetration of credit as well. So these are all frictions on the factor markets, capital, labor, which then impacts aggregate supply in the economy. And if you have a situation where aggregate demand increases without aggregate supply increasing, then obviously you will have inflation. I think that's Econ 101 in some sense. And if you, for instance, look at what happened after the global financial crisis, the policy response was focused primarily on revenue expenditure, that sort of the farm loan waiver, for instance, which expanded aggregate demand, but did nothing to the aggregate supply. Capital expenditure was decreased, no reforms were done, and that's why we had runaway inflation, touching double digits, in fact, for 3 years. A current account deficit, because when aggregate supply does not change, but aggregate demand changes, obviously, people have to rely on a lot more imports, and that's why we had current account deficit touching close to 6%, and a runaway fiscal deficit. So triple whammies of high current account deficit, high fiscal deficit, and high inflation, which led to the macroeconomic crisis in 2013. Now we've actually sort of learned the lessons from there. Instead done what we did after the Asian financial crisis, which is we did capital expenditure. The golden quadrilateral, for instance, was built at that time. Reforms were done, small scale reservations were removed, for instance, and that generated economies of scale, supply side, improved aggregate supply. The entire telecom revolution, the reforms were done at that time. Today, if actually India is such a leader in telecom, it's because of some of the reforms that were done at that time. And privatization was embarked upon at that time. There was a full ministry for disinvestment that was started for the first time, and as a result we had growth that was sustained without inflation, without a macro crisis. What India has done now is basically replicate that successful template after the Asian financial crisis, but at a much higher scale in terms of reforms, in terms of the capital expenditure that is being focused on. This budget, for instance, has increased the outlay for capital expenditure by close to 40%. Healthcare, the outlays have been increased by about 135%. And so not only in terms of physical, infrastructure, but even soft infrastructure, human capital, that is also being focused on, all of which will have impact on, GDP growth going forward in this decade.
And I want to pick up on your earlier point. You talked about empowering the private sector in order to do ethical wealth creation. As an economic advisor to a government, how do you support policies that will ensure that wealth creation is ethical, that it doesn't simply exacerbate economic inequalities and create a greater divide between the haves and the have-nots?
Risham, I would urge viewers to take a look at a chapter that we wrote in this year's economic survey, which was titled Growth and Inequality, Conflict or Convergence. Now, if you look at the debate, and that's one of the privileges of being an economist, that you actually get to follow the literature across the world. If you look at the literature on inequality, people like Thomas Piketty and others actually have written on this. In the advanced economies, the debate has been about this conflict between growth and inequality. The literature, in fact, has shown that while, in growth or GDP per capita, for instance, actually, has either a positive, effect or, maybe no effect on socio-economic indicators like healthcare, health indicators, education indicators, crime, mental health, etc. Growing inequality actually has a negative impact. In other words, societies, and I'm talking about advanced economies, where inequality is greater, you have worse healthcare, worse education, worse mental health, greater crime. That is what you find for the advanced economies. But what we have to be careful is to not extrapolate directly from the situation for advanced economies to emerging economies like ours, because there are two critical differences. One, our growth potential is much higher than that for the advanced economies. While the advanced economies, would be very happy growing at 3%, we would not be happy even if we grow at 6%. We want to be growing at 7-8%. That's the first difference. The second important thing is that absolute levels of poverty, which advanced economies don't face, but we still have. So the potential to actually reduce poverty is very high, and the growth is also very high. That's why that was the motivation for us to go and look at in the Indian context. This tension that you see in the advanced economies between growth and inequality, do you see that tension in India? Turns out, no. Actually, when you look at the same indicators, socioeconomic indicators of health, education, mental health, crime, actually what we find is the evidence is contra to what you find in the advanced economies, that both inequality and growth have a similar effect. So there is convergence in terms of the impact of inequality versus growth on in the Indian context. And that's because we are at a different stage of development where we need to be growing the pie, and by growing the pie, we generate the resources to be able to do welfare programs. And one of the other chapters in the economic survey actually showed how over the last 6 years, welfare programs, the effectiveness of that has enhanced significantly. The last chapter, in this year's economic survey was titled The Bare Necessities. Bare necessities of drinking water, of sanitation, a healthy environment to live. And when you look at the data, then by the way, this is not government data, not administrative data, survey data by the National Statistical and Survey Organization shows that in 2018 compared to 2012, the access to basic, bare necessities has increased in general across the country. But more importantly, pertinent to your question, it has increased far more for the lowest quintile of the population, the poorest people. So while rich have also, has been an increase, it's far more for the poor. And that basically, when you put these two, chapters together, what we find is India focusing on growth, generating the resources, and using those resources to be able to actually, do welfare schemes, which have actually now started being done much more efficiently, is the model that India needs to follow so that there is ethical wealth creation. And not only do we have an expanding pie, but also we have a situation where actually the poor are especially taken care of.
That's really fascinating. And I want to pick up on, you talk about growing the pie, which I think is such a great way to think about it. But in a way, it feels as though COVID, for a short amount of time at least, really pushed the pie off the table for a little bit there. So how has COVID impacted the government's economic strategy? And what changes will we see going forward to deal with making sure that the negative potential implications of COVID are dealt with, the ramifications are not felt for any longer than they have to be, and that we get growth back on the table for the future?
So there are two aspects to your question. Firstly, just to continue on this growth versus inequality, if you look at this year, a lot of economists are saying that India, for instance, some of them are saying that there are while a lot of economists are saying there's a V-shaped recovery, some economists are saying there's a K-shaped recovery. What is a K-shaped recovery? That the bigger firms are actually doing better, and the richer individuals are actually not as affected. The poorer are affected. I think there can't be a better illustration of the importance of growth for people at the bottom of the pyramid. When till last year, till 2020, when we were growing, the concerns about inequality were not as much as in a year when you actually have had, not only India, but the entire world has had, a recession. So I think that clearly illustrates how important growth is for people at the bottom of the pyramid. And I think that is something which we actually need to be focusing on, because without growth, you do not get the resources to be able to do welfare programs. That's first point. But just growth itself actually lifts people, at the bottom of the pyramid far more. And I think, what we've shown in the economic survey, the chapter on inequality as well, is that 85% of reduction in poverty, absolute numbers of poverty, actually comes from growth. Inequality actually contributes much less to absolute poverty than growth does. And so we need to be focusing, really have a laser-like focus on growth, because that is what will deliver prosperity for the maximum number of people. That's one key, change in terms of the focus, because policy making is all about having clarity of objectives. And I think what I'm emphasizing again and again is that India, given its current stage of development, needs to be focused on growth, because that is also the way to alleviate inequality as well. Of course, some of the discussion that we've had before on how are we pursuing growth now, that is by enabling and empowering the private sector. That is the important change that we basically are having. In other words, to summarize, post-COVID, I think India has much more clarity that we need to be focusing on growth, because that is the way to reduce inequality and uplift the poorer sections of society even more, and enabling the private sector, because that is the way in which growth really actually happens. In the 2018-19 survey, we had shown, by looking at every country over the last 50 years that grew at least 5% plus growth rate, real terms, for at least a decade. And what we showed was that actually happens through the virtuous cycle of investment, which leads to growth, which basically creates jobs and thereby consumption. And that's how growth proceeds. That's what India is really trying to do going forward in the post-COVID economy.
And that's where your focus is with the 4-pillar strategy for growth.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, well, thank you very much for clarifying that. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about the sectors that you foresee as driving the growth and recovery in India. I know you've talked very passionately about empowering the private sector, but are there any sectors in particular within that you think are going to be the engine of India's recovery?
I think that's a good question, Resham. So, if you look at India, in the last 3 decades, India has become a very service-oriented economy. About 60% of the gross value added comes from the service sector, which is a tertiary sector. So if you classify as primary, secondary, and tertiary, services falls in the tertiary sector, and that's very good. Actually, that's something that we should be doing. But given the young population we have and the need for jobs for all of them, and one of the things I've always believed in, I come from humble background. My father was the first person in our family to have a formal sector job, and that is what enabled him to educate us, and that's what gave us the opportunities that we got to live the so-called Indian dream, the equivalent of the American dream. So that happened through a formal sector job. So for our population, the young population that we have, jobs are incredibly important, and therefore we need to empower and enable the primary sector and the secondary sector, which is, when we talk about the primary sector, that's agriculture. Mm-hmm. Secondary sector is basically manufacturing. And so if you look at the policy emphasis over the last two and a half years, what we are trying to do is to really enable manufacturing. And that's why these labor reforms, the change in the MSME definition, so that they can grow, they can reap economies of scale. A lot of the incentives for exports, for instance, the production-linked incentives. All these are really focused on enabling manufacturing. And if you see the PMI, the Purchasing Managers Index for manufacturing, in the last, it's been hitting 8-10-year highs, because that has been one of the key aspects of policy emphasis, because the number of jobs that can be created for our youth is far more. The potential is much greater. And therefore, the emphasis on agriculture is also important, because we also need to move people from agriculture to manufacturing. And that's where the farm reform bills are also extremely important. So the focus has been on the primary sector and on the secondary sector, that's agriculture and manufacturing, because those can create jobs. Investment can come in. When jobs get created, you actually have a middle class that gets created, which basically has the purchasing power to push aggregate demand. anticipating such aggregate demand, private firms, then invest a lot more, and that really accelerates this virtuous cycle. If you go and look at history as well, the United States after the Great Depression, grew by really creating this middle class and creating a huge manufacturing base. For instance, cities like Michigan, grew primarily from such a large manufacturing base. And if you see today, some of those cities have actually have sort of lost their prominence because manufacturing has not been as important. But I think given the stage of development that India is in, we need to be therefore empowering these sectors, the agriculture and the manufacturing sectors. Those are the emphasis that we're actually placing on.
So given the importance of those two sectors, how do fluctuating commodity and oil prices impact the policies, the economic policies that you're advising on to government? How do you take into account the fluctuations and counter for them?
So one of the key aspects that I've always believed in is that, while exogenous variables like oil prices, and in a globalized world, and India now is the 5th largest economy in the world. So India will invariably be exposed to exogenous shocks. But what is endogenous is the policy response. And one of the key things that we have to do is that policy-induced uncertainty should be minimized to the largest extent. That is something that is within the control of the policymakers. Oil prices, we don't have much of a role on, but we should therefore be focusing on policies that reduce policy-induced uncertainty, so that private actors can actually can really take that into account, plan their schedules for investment, production, etc. Because research, for instance, by Nick Bloom and others at Stanford now shows that policy uncertainty is a very important aspect of macro uncertainty, and that is something that is actually the policymakers can indeed influence. So that is in our control, and we therefore need to focus on reducing that to the largest extent.
And then I want to jump back. You talked about the AS, the focus on AS and supply side policies. It's not a specific to India issue, of course. Education has been disrupted around the world. Many of our young people have gone months, if not a year now, with disrupted education, and obviously that's been exacerbated where there's the lack of online teaching available to people. What do you think the government should be doing to ensure that the next generation are not negatively impacted by that loss of education?
I think that's also a very nice question. So if you look at what has happened in the last 1 year, smartphone buying, especially among the sections of the population where smartphones were not there before COVID, has increased. And when I speak sort of anecdotally to people, it is because they wanted their kids to be able to take online education, not be able to fall behind their peers. So I think one of the key aspects that India is looking to really utilize is the demonstrative effect of COVID. For instance, just to, I think, take the most visible example, 1 year back, I think if I had to be speaking to such an esteemed audience, I would have had to be in the United Kingdom. But here we are, me sitting in New Delhi, and reaching out to such an esteemed audience. I think that is a demonstrative effect. Similarly, my son, who's been he was in the 10th grade, and incidentally in the University of Cambridge curriculum. His entire schooling happened, in the online, and yet not just, I mean, some of you may say, oh, my son is privileged enough to have, but not just that, others as well. Some of our people who come to help us as well, even their kids have had education through online. So I think that's something which we really have to enable, because while kids get back to school, there will be learning deficiencies, and so after school hours are also important to bridge some of the gaps in education. And also, I think the second aspect that we're focusing on is to ensure that the learning, sort of some of the falling behind of the learning does not lead people to drop out of school, which is actually something that can happen, especially in some of the vulnerable sections. young girls, and those that are at the bottom of the pyramid. And the government therefore is really thinking about ways to incentivize such people to come back. India, for instance, has a good midday meal scheme, which has not been in the pandemic has not been physically used as much, but lapping onto that and building on that might be ways to really get kids back to school. I think this is really an important issue, not just in India but across countries, and all of us are trying to enable some of this by using online as well. I think EduTech here can play a big role. In the last 1 year in India, startups focused on EduTech have really some of them have become unicorns, and I think that is also a strength that we have, that we actually are looking to latch onto.
Definitely. Well, Subramanian, I know for me, and I'm sure I can speak on behalf of the audience, that we could sit here listening to you all day, but sadly we've come to the end of the session. So I wanted to thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your insights, and for guiding the government at this very challenging time. If you've been watching this session and you have thoughts, please share it on our social media wall with the hashtag ABLFcity. And if you missed the start or middle or end of this fantastic session and you want to hear all about Subramanian's thoughts, you can always come back right here and view it on demand anytime after today. So Subramanian, thank you once again for your time and insights, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. Remember that we are back every month featuring global leaders in powerful conversations.
Thank you.